You're listening to the Boundless Authenticity Podcast, where we discuss everything related to the evolution of human consciousness.
At the very least, people need to understand that the United States builds bunkers, which are basically cities underground, every 3 months.
Basically, when you dream, you tap into your subconscious. It is your nocturnal intuition, your creativity and imagination unchained from conscious reason, ego and logic.
They're biologically alive, but they have no soul. They have AI consciousness. They can alter your conscious of the brain to get the brain.
We live in a multidimensional reality, whether it comes through esoteric information in the spiritual realms or the UFO people, experiencers, or mainstream through quantum physics and through mainstream science now realizing that parallel dimensions probably exist.
We're all spiritual beings. We're all having these human experiences. We've heard that phrase over and over and over. But what does that really mean?
You know, all the big questions of life, we have these answers inside of our souls.
We're ultimately studying the nature of what it is to be human, good and evil, our psychology, how we think, and our health. That's why I love Bruce Lee's great quote, all knowledge is ultimately self-knowledge.
The Boundless Authenticity Podcast. Welcome back to the Boundless Authenticity Podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in to the show. Today's guest is David Whitehead, the creator of the Cult of the Medics series of films. David is a martial artist, podcaster, freedom advocate, and truth warrior. In this episode, we talk about David's series, The Dark Side of Tibetan Buddhism. Listen to David's podcast, dwtruthwarrior.com. Watch Cult of the Medics, cultofthemedics.com. And follow me, Jahan, on Instagram at www.instagram.com/JahanSator. That's JehanSattaur. So David, how's it going?
Hey, it's good, man. Good to be back. Good to see you again.
Yeah, it's great to have you back on. Great to see you. Yeah. So, I've been wanting to talk to you about the dark side of Tibetan Buddhism. I thought that was fascinating. And it's not something that you hear very often, you know? How did you even look into that?
Well, it started a while back when I was personally studying Buddhism. I studied Buddhism for a few years in and out. It was very integral to a lot of the martial art stuff and was very much embedded in that. So curiosity, you know, I've gone through a lot of the different religions, you know, to different degrees. And Buddhism was one of the ones that I looked into. And I found a lot of amazing things in there. And there's a lot of great teachings. And there's actually a lot that lines up with other religions when you know how to look at it. But then when I realized that we're here in the West critiquing the Catholic Church or different Christian groups and churches, and because of corruption, you know, I'm not going here talking about people's personal faith or belief or religion. I'm speaking about the institutions were becoming very corrupt, and learned that from various insiders, and it seemed like it was all good to throw mud at the three dominant religions in the world, which are Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. That's usually what gets all the flack. But when you start to talk about anything negative related to what's going on with these Dalai Lamas and what's going on in Tibet for real, with human trafficking, with rampant pedophilia, with all kinds of other issues that are going on in those religious centers in the same way that they're going on in our religious centers, there's just weird cognitive dissonance where people don't want to hear about it. And they'd make the same assumption, like you're attacking the actual belief system, even though I personally have an issue with the doctrine of non-dualism, which is basically the foundation of Buddhism, at least as it is now. I believe that Buddhism, the original canon of Buddhism, has been altered slightly over the years by different priests and different groups. And just like all the religions, there's different sects now that are competing with each other for who has the right interpretation of all this stuff. So I also picked up a great book by a woman named Christine Chandler, she worked in Tibet in the monasteries under some of the Rinpoches and the different lamas. And she was right at the top. And she was like an administrator on their behalf and was even in charge of taking care of some of the affairs going on there. And she basically wrote this book. And trying to remember the name of it. I did the whole series, the whole program that I did based off this book and some other stuff as well. But it's called Enthralled. That's the name of the book. If you look up the book Enthralled by Christine Chandler, it's just an absolute mind-blowing testimony of somebody that lived there for, I don't know how long, 10 years, 15 years, and saw things firsthand. And when she started to point out the connections that people like the Dalai Lama specifically have with the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab, the United Nations, etc., you really start to ask some questions. So she started framing the questions. I started looking into it. And that's where the series was born, is it's an exploration of the dark side of Tibetan Buddhism. So I think everything has a good side and a bad side, and people like to ignore the bad stuff and just focus on the good stuff. I'm the kind of person that's like, if we want to know the truth about how corruption came to be what it is in our world, we've got to start looking at some of the bad stuff as well to understand how it works.
I agree with you. It's all relevant. I kind of fell into that rabbit hole briefly in 2017 because all I did was meditate, and I loved the Buddhist philosophy and things like that. So I tried to follow that as much as possible. And then for some reason, one of my friends was like, hey, have you seen this documentary? And it was about how the next Dalai Lama was kidnapped by the Chinese government or something like that. And it just, my jaw hit the floor, and I was like, I can't even believe that's happening. And I just kind of fell down a similar rabbit hole, and I realized, the Dalai Lama's out there making the satanic gestures and stuff just like everybody else. I wonder what that's about, and totally ruined my thing for the Buddhist way of things, but I guess I shouldn't have let it ruin the entire thing, but I just very quickly lost interest in that. Not that what they're saying isn't true, because it's a lot of stuff that is true, and I guess that's the way it goes. There's a lot of truisms in a lot of the things that are darker. But I saw that you made this series, and I was like, oh, somebody else gets it. So I thought it was really interesting. And you had the it's the pictures and stuff, the information for downloading your Dropbox, and I looked through all that stuff as well too. I was like, wow, yeah, seen that before.
Yeah, I tried to put, so what I did was, this one you're talking about is on my premium channel. I do most of my work is out there for free, but I do have some that's premium. And what it is I just go through a lot of these books that I have sitting on the shelf and projects I want to put out, just different sides on things, and just give my own take on it. So it's a smaller group of people that I work with there. It allows me to do the work that I do, and we do these deep dives. And then what I want to do is I'm trying to get Christine Chandler on my show, on my public show, to do an interview on it. She's willing to do it. We're just trying to coordinate the timing. And there are others that have pointed this out as well. And there are many testimonials you can still see on YouTube and other channels of people that experienced abuse, sexual abuse, ritual abuse, when in the presence of a lot of these priests and these different Buddhists. And I remember even seeing, when I was in the martial art world, we would have workshops and seminars where you'd have different martial art masters from different martial arts teaching throughout the day, and you got to rotate mats and experience all these different guys. And there was a couple of years where they brought Buddhist monks in from Tibet. And it was amazing how both times we flew them into Canada, they had problems of them trying to sneak out of the venue and run away and escape and not go back. And it was like, wow, I thought this was like the best place to live in the world. These enlightened masters living on the mountains. Like, why would you run away from that to live in like Ottawa? Like, what's the hell? What's up with that? And it just kind of gave an indication that there's probably a lot more going on than meets the eye, even behind the scenes for a lot of these people who are raised in these circles. And then when you start studying the underlying philosophy of it all, and you start getting into the way religion moved across the world and the way it expanded and the similarities, the differences, etc., you start to realize that some of it is just an organic flow of history where humans evolve their ideas, corruption takes hold, we're all human, we get it. But when it's beyond just a few bad apples here and there, and it actually is more like a systemic problem, like what we saw with the Catholic Church and the Book of the Mormons and all these everywhere, you realize that there could be an actual organized thing going on behind the veil of many of these religious institutions. And think about it. I mean, again, this is why when I separate my work where I have my own personal view on the flaws in Buddhist thinking, right? Just as I do on the flaws in Christian thinking or, any of these religions. Everybody's got flaws, right? And who am I to judge in the end? It's just my opinion. But when you look at what's going on within the institution where it's not acting in accord with its own doctrine of universal compassion and love for all living things, and humans are just gardeners and caretakers of the planet, and every action has a certain amount of karma attached to it. So your actions in this life echo throughout all of your lives because they definitely believe in reincarnation and things like that. And you go, well, then why are so many of the people in your cult acting in such a criminal fashion? So you start to realize, well, there are people who hide behind the light. This is where a criminal network would hide. Just think about, we hear about places like Thailand, for example, right? Which is just notorious for human trafficking and organ trafficking and all that stuff. And there's a big network, and you go, okay. And then you hear about China, what goes down in China, and you hear about all these different places, and you think, okay, but when you ask the average sort of new age person about the sacred Dalai Lama and the Tibetan Buddhism and all that, they're like, no, that's the holy place. That none of that stuff is untouched because that's the holy place. And I'm like, well, if I was a criminal gang that wanted to get people into my door and get them to become passive and receptive to everything I was going to tell them, I would want to teach them self-hypnosis, which is exactly what that style of meditation is. And I'm not saying there isn't benefits to meditation or whatever, but I personally am an advocate for active meditation, but everybody should find their own thing. But think about what you're doing. You're humming and hawing. You're sitting for hours and hours in painful positions, and they're going to have all their ways of explaining that. And maybe there is a legitimate form of it. But if I was a criminal predator and I wanted to start an enterprise in that way, you wouldn't want to advertise that. You'd want to play the wolf in sheep's clothing game. You would want to hide in the houses of light where people come in already with their guard down. When you walk into a religious temple, especially with the awe that everything is surrounded with these monks, right? Living in the mountains, they're close to the heart chakra of the planet. And it's this whole mysteria that we have about this. It's like a myth that we all just believe. And you think, okay, well, they would, if you wanted to take advantage of that, you hide in plain sight. You hide where people go already with their guard down. They're there because I want to be a student of the ancient monasteries and the monks. I want to learn the secrets of the universe. And I know they're going to send me through all these different trials, and they're going to make me sleep outside on the ground, and then I have to come back and beg to get inside for a bowl of rice and like all that stuff. But that's part of my spiritual development. And maybe some of that starts to get justified, but then it keeps going. And this was what this testimony and many testimonies that I've looked at, this is what Christine's testimony was that it was like they were leading you down a thread and they were implanting ideas through the meditation. It wasn't just like, we're going to teach you how to have your own connection to the divine presence in the universe or to nature or whatever, right? It was a very prescribed ritual way. And when she started to investigate programs like MK Ultra and some of these mind control experiments, she started to see similarities with the way that they were bringing in these students. And then you have all the stories of these young underage girls coming out and saying, yeah, my priest, I can't always remember the name. My priest is basically asking me to have sex with him on a regular basis because that is me having sex with the bliss, and I'm learning more about myself, and he's just the vehicle. And there's all these excuses they give to these poor, impressionable girls. And so you just see that obviously not every Buddhist temple and not every Buddhist is under the scrutiny here. But when the most popular one, like the Dalai Lama that everybody just looks past, is literally hobnobbing with Bill Gates and Klaus Schwab and all the top guys. And he's on his website, he's advocating for basically the World Economic Forum Great Reset. He's advocating for the UN Sustainable Development Goals. He's advocating for the end of Western capitalism and free market. He's advocating for collectivism and non-dualism, which means there is no such thing as good and evil. And when you start to see that, I had friends of mine, Jan, that when they started to wake up to other factors, so they live in the West, they live in Canada or whatever, and they would wake up to the tyranny going on in government, or the way that the economy is being sort of rigged against us, or they wake up to these little things. That can be very traumatic for people who had never known about this going on. They never studied criminal history or anything like that. And so they wake up, and immediately, if they didn't have another foundational faith or belief system of any kind, they're looking for an escape out. They're looking for an escape mechanism, because the evil that they're learning about could be so dark that they couldn't deal with that, knowing that that exists. And so I would have friends that would start waking up to what's happening, and then they get into these new age things, and suddenly they're coming back and telling me, well, Dave, evil is just a construct made up by the minds of men. I'm like, where the hell did you hear that? It's just made up, is it? And they're like, yeah, good and evil is just a figment of our imagination. It's almost like you're talking to those people that think they can switch genders every 5 minutes if they want to. There's no rules or laws of any kind in nature. You're like, wait a minute. And you start to realize, when I was picking these little pieces up, I'm like, where are you getting this stuff from? And then I looked into the foundational philosophies that built these religions like Buddhism before the Buddha allegedly existed, like the lineage of the thought. And then you study it through these other traditions, and you go, oh, they're bringing in this, in philosophy, they call it non-dualism, where it's essentially that. It's very close also to this sort of idea of what they call solipsism, where basically the universe literally revolves around you. There is no objective reality. And so this was another thing that Christine Chandler brings up in her book, is a lot of the conditioning that they were programming them with was to program them that their senses are not seeing what they think they're seeing. Everything is an illusion. I'm sure you've heard this gig before. Everything is an illusion. And it's like, okay, well, I guess it's an illusion on the sense that humans have erected all these institutions and all these cities and this whole culture. And like, I guess you could say that that's sort of like a little illusion in some way, or we look at illusion, but reality itself, to what extent is it an illusion? Could you prove it to me? And, everybody has their take on it. It's a very sticky issue. But when you start getting into that everything is an illusion world, you can start to now justify evil and go, oh, it's just an illusion. This is just a ride. You're a temporal body, and eventually you're just going to keep reincarnating. So it kind of justifies, the history of evil in a way. And they're like, yeah, evil's a product of the Catholic Church and all this stuff. And you're like, yeah, but what about like preying on children, right? Vulnerable children who don't have critical thinking, who don't understand their sexuality. And here you are, an adult, indoctrinating them to make them passive so that you can sexually exploit this person. I call that evil because it's violating somebody's free will, and you're manipulating their mind to be able to basically use them like a resource and no longer look at them as this divine, flowering, love and light human being anymore. They're a plaything for your sexual desires. To me, that's evil. Stealing is evil. Murder is evil. These are the things that we call evil. And so to say that's a construct, that's to me a perfect cover story for pedophiles, for criminals, for predators, to basically say, guys, we don't exist and we're not doing evil to you right now, while they're doing evil to you right in front of your face. And they've got it down to a science where they can literally get the victim to actually believe that. And I think that's what a lot of these rites and rituals and passages and all this meditation stuff in the end really boils down to. And I'll preface that by saying, this particular group, this sort of like cult within a cult. And again, I'm not trying to generalize every Buddhist and every monastery and I'm not doing that. There's a core network that has infiltrated the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. It's long aged, old. And these people also, unknowing to the world, have their own agenda for world domination. They literally want this particular belief system to become the dominant religion in the world. just as all the others are. So for everybody kind of slept on the Buddhists, man. They thought it was just, oh, it's the jihadi Islam, it's the Christians that, it's all these different religions. And you're like, no, I see your Jewish conspiracy, your Christian conspiracy, and I raise you the Tibetan Buddhist conspiracy. I think there's conspiracy going on in all these groups, but everybody forgets about what's going on in the East, man.
2 words. I agree.
Well, and I'm sure you could validate it, right, Jan? Like you could go look at this. Like, have you had any experiences where you've met, or what about even the philosophy? What was your experience with the philosophy? Why did it not really sink in for you after a while, or what made you kind of move on from it?
Well, okay, so here's an example. I got so deep into it that I wanted to kill the ego using their particular methodologies. And what I realized is that I had a very individual experience of the application of the information, as would anyone else who actually applied any other set of information. You have your own, like in my work, I call it internal representation systems, your own coping strategies that you formulate based on subconscious information, all the things that you've stored your entire life up until whatever point it is, and that you get into that new information, and you try to tunnel vision things. You try to apply new information through the filter of everything you knew before, and you kind of push against that for a while. So I was like, okay, I am having trouble accepting this. Let me go harder on it. So I started doing strange things like meditating for 3-4 hours a day at a time just to see what would happen. I'd take my shoes off and take my shirt off and go outside in the middle of the snow and shovel snow to try to kill the ego and battle against the frigid feeling on my nipples. So, I would do all kinds of things like that and like try to battle with my mind. And I probably took it the wrong direction, but I did learn things from that. I don't want anybody to get me wrong. I did learn things from that. I did learn to grow through suffering, as they say. But then I realized that this would be too hard. If this is what they're going through, doing like soji and doing all kinds of weird rituals and things like that, to initiations, if you will, to bring people into this way of wisdom, that was really the moment that I kind of started paying attention to what cults really were. You know what I mean? Because apart from the Buddhist stuff, I was very much into the New Age philosophy and things like that. Because that was when I was just trying to get my first coaching certificate and stuff like that. And I realized, oh, this is a scam too. So, I just kind of,
personal experience. Look at you. Like that's a positive thing where you said, I'm going to go test this out for myself. And you did it. You had your experience. You even gained some benefit from it. And then, you've probably taken a few bits from that and then maybe some bits from this over here. And you've kind of put your own philosophy together, your own thinking. I think that's very remarkable. A lot of people can't get out of it. And I just wanted to comment really quickly on the ego. This is a real big penny because this is a huge thing it's embedded itself in the culture already, where everybody conflates the ego with somebody that is some kind of a brutish stamp on the face of all the people in front of them type of person, like a narcissist or something like that. But that is not what the ego is. The ego is a natural function of who you are. And there's a gentleman by the name of Wilhelm Reich who did a lot of work in the 1930s. He was the first author in America to have his books burned because they didn't understand what he was trying to say at the time. But he developed the idea of orgone energy. He called it orgone, and the idea of soma, the somatic intelligence of the body. And he said, I disagree with a lot of the psychologists that the ego is somehow in the brain. It's somehow in your head. He looked at the physical body itself as being the ego. Because how do we describe the ego? The ego is that thing that allows you to interface with reality. It's your identity. It's all this it's the surface. And even when they describe it in psychology, that's how it's described. And it's always been described as like the inner child that just needs to be put in its place kind of a thing, right? But when you start unpacking that, this starts to actually create something called body disassociation or body hatred, self-sadism, basically. It ingrains it in people right from day one, is the idea that a part of you is like this alien implant that you have to work to get out. Like all this, your primitive side, your human side, your defensiveness, all these things are some kind of an evil thing. And you go, well, yeah, but without the ego, I would be dead. I mean, I wouldn't, and that almost seems like what a lot of people are wishing for here, which would prove people like Freud right, where he's talking about the death instinct and all this kind of stuff. Like, we think people are sitting there closing their eyes and sitting in uncomfortable positions for like, I've seen people do it for like 9-10 hours at a time, starving themselves, and then you look into the Catholics and the church where they would whip themselves and flog themselves for various sins. You start to see in all these religions, there's a dynamic of self-abuse or an identity issue that can only be solved through suffering. And you realize the suffering they're asking you to inflict upon yourself is part of the training. It's the part of, they're trying to turn off a part of your brain, and that part of your brain is your ability to think critically. Because remember, your physical body being the ego, let's imagine that your body has its own intelligence, that not all of your intelligence is derived from your brain. Your brain might be the pilot of the craft, but the craft that you have, the body that you have, is itself intelligent because it's an extension of nature that is everything, right? So it is what you feel with. It is your sensations. It's all your sensations is the body. And Tesla had some beautiful things. In fact, I've been reading this quote quite a bit. I'm going to read it to you right now because it, to me, is the counter to the doctrine of Tibetan Buddhism and the New Age movement, which is sort of, it's based on, if you want to pin it down, some of the two major ancient philosophical schools that sort of birth a lot of religion and a lot of the other philosophical schools, they came out of ancient Egypt. And it was Gnosticism and Hermeticism. And there were many crossovers, and there's different groups and splinters, and they all kind of have their own way. But when you get into learning that the Gnostic paradigm originally was a body-denying paradigm, it was the paradigm that the body is a cage of the soul, not a house of the soul. That the earth itself, the physical earth, is actually just an illusion. They were the first ones to come up with simulation theory. And they didn't call it that. That's just the scientific word we use today. They looked at it as that Earth was created by an evil demiurge figure that created Earth as a fake simulation to try to either house humans on or to grow them on, or there's different variations. But the idea was that it's synthetic. It's not part of the original creation. It's like another incubated thing that is its own thing. And there might be people that study Gnosticism that go, oh, that's not what we think. Well, the original I'm talking about, okay? And so that idea of body denying and earth denying, which I can get as to why I think that idea even got born into the world, that system traveled east to the Eastern religions. And it's very much in the East, and you see it in everywhere, right? Now, if you go to India and you read some of the ancient Indian stuff, it's completely opposite of this. So I'm not to say that it was all dominant there, but it crept its way in, and it became a part of that system over there. And then when the West started to move away from its religious roots of Christianity and all of that, and it went more secular, you had a vacuum where humans do need some kind of spirituality. We do need some kind of path to follow, and there's a need that we have. And so people go, well, I don't have my Christian faith anymore, or I don't have my whatever it is. I don't have my faith. I'm a scientist now, and I'm feeling like if I'm just an atheist and this world is just meaningless, that makes me feel depressed. So I'm going to find something new. So there was a huge movement during the 60s and 70s, sort of the hippie era, which was influenced by a lot of this body-denying Buddhist type mentality, this Eastern stuff. So it was very attractive. And as that got brought in, it started to sort of grow into its own thing. And then there was this huge rash in the West of these different cults in the 80s that grew up. And all of them that I looked at, you know, your Process Church, Jim Jones, Heaven's Gate, all of that, have those elements of that Gnostic paradigm or that world body denying paradigm embedded in it, along with the conditioning of the things that you would do that end up just essentially being self-abuse, right? For the purpose of attaining enlightenment, of course, right? We got to turn off all the senses so that the spirit can fly. And then it gets to the point where, like with Applewhite there with Heaven's Gate, he's telling people, well, the only way we can be truly conscious and aware and ascended souls is if we actually leave our bodies, because the body is such a prison, it's such a limitation, it's so evil and filthy and all these primitive drives and all that. So let's transcend the body. Let's transcend the planet Earth. Let's transcend reality. And let's go to the 9th dimension above human. That's what they used to talk about. Well, when you look at the actual structure of the way this, especially this tantric Buddhist system is set up, is they have a very similar setup, a very similar structure to their belief. And it's all centered around, it's this consciousness housed in the body that matters, yet the matter of your body is some kind of a fallen state. It's an evil thing and it's to be denied, right? Well, that immediately has people disconnect from reality. And I'll finish this little rant with one little story. The Buddha himself, the character upon which the entire religion is based, there's stories of him having his disciples meditate on dead corpses and dead matter for extended periods of time. It's like another one of those initiation rites, was like to really understand nature and to understand the evils of it, the distraction of it, the temptation of it, the limitation of it. Let's look at it as it decays and dies. And they would study how a body is dying and what happens after as the decomposition comes in. Very morbid stuff. Well, it got to a point where the priests that were his students or these disciples were killing themselves because they couldn't think about that. You're telling the human being your very body this is what it is. It's just this matter that's just going to die and decay. And it's just that feeling. So he had to modify the whole thing in order to not teach this doctrine that ended up resulting in these guys just offing themselves. And so, but the flavors were still there. And then other priests came in and further manipulated it and further manipulated it. And I think in the end, this is the ultimate carrot on the stick that predatory classes and predatory criminal types and psychopaths and people who are themselves already, they've switched the light off within. They're just playing the game, right? So they need to now siphon energy off others instead of being able to generate it themselves. So they become predators. Well, they figured out that they could set up a whole dog and pony show with all the big cathedrals or temples and the whole thing. And they could use that as a smoke screen to attract people in, that then they could then indoctrinate them into a state where they would start to basically deny themselves, and even to the point where you're rejecting what you are as a human, and that the only salvation is through the guru. So now you're not going on your own journey of trying to connect to the dharmic path or anything like that. You are now having to do it through an in-between, right? Who then tells you and prescribes the divine path for you. Yet that divine path doesn't lead you to your own communication with spirit. It leads you into communication with them and their rites and rituals and the whole thing. So this is a way of gaining power by people who don't feel that they have naturally any of their own power. And if you have the belief that this is a fallen, evil world, that nature is an illusion, and that your body is an illusion, and that it's evil, and you need to transcend it and ignore everything about it because that's all just evil. Well, how can you create good in the world? Because we've had thousands of years of this idea, and look at the state of things. So the evidence to me is right there in the pudding.
2 words. I agree. And, I think it's the same trick over and over again to distract people from who they are at the core by using the very thing that should connect you to your true self. And that's why, in my work, I work with people on the subconscious level, and I preach to them individualism. I tell them you have to apply the things that I'm telling you. You have to be able to be a person in the world. Meditation is great if you just want to relax, but save that shit for going to sleep at night. You know, you want to turn your brain off and go to sleep. That's when you meditate. You lay down, you close your eyes, you drift off to whatever dimension you want. I'm not going to get into that. You can just learn to be with yourself, and the body is the technology. That's what I tell people. The body is the technology. All the other technology that we see outside, iPads and shit, that's not the technology. This is it. And there's every attempt, and we see it more and more, to take people away from the intelligence that lives within this unit. I tell people all the time, your subconscious is in your body. All that somatic stuff that you were talking about, I believe 100%. All the information that we ever experience gets stored inside of this body. And so they do everything that they can to keep us outside of our critical thinking, like you said, and outside of our hearts, because those are the two places that need to be communicating in tandem in order for us to actually survive and make it outside of the matrix, if you will. You know, I have an issue with that term as well too, but you know.
No, I know what you mean.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm glad you talk to people like that on an individual level, because that's how you empower people. And remember that we also then, when you study this and you realize, okay, the houses of light, the houses of truth, the places that are known by most people as being, that's where you go for health. That's where you go for God. That's where you go to have community and connect with other humans. And there's this, because humans do need these things in our lives. But you have to know that obviously that's where, like when you look at nature, where do predators set up the trap for their prey? Where do they hunt their prey? They go to the watering holes. They go to where they feed. They go to they track them to the places that they go for food, so that they know for sure that that's where that animal's going to be, because that's their food, right? So if you want that animal to be your food, the easiest way to catch an animal that's faster than you is to just wait and stalk it and figure out where it goes for food. Because when it's eating food, that's when its guard is down. So the food they're advertising with these priests and all of these, and as all these religions are guilty of it. Everybody, you know, even the scientists, you know, not all science. I mean, the scientific institutions, you know, they've got their share in this too.
You mean the cult of scientism
stuff? Yeah, exactly. There's definitely a scientism. And scientism to me is when scientists don't even follow their own rules of what the scientific method is, and they start creating dogma and they start creating beliefs, and they don't actually have scientific evidence to back it up. And they themselves, even though they're like, I'm a materialist, I believe in studying the natural world, they're off into all kinds of quantum stuff and out of the mind stuff. And hey, everybody's got their opinion on that. But you start to realize that humans are doing this naturally. And you go, oh, well, why? That's the question I'm trying to get to here is, why are we even showing up to these places? Why do people join cults? Why do people need tyrannical governments and actually feel more comfortable with a tyrannical type of government? Like, people want more tyranny in the world. They want less freedom. What is this? Like, I started to realize that evil doesn't work in the world. Tyranny doesn't work in the world, and criminality doesn't work in the world unless good people don't expose it and rout it out and do nothing to do it. So the question, and I remember when you'd hear that phrase in church, like, evil always thrives because good people do nothing. Well, they'd always leave you hanging at the end of that. You're like, okay, yeah, makes sense. Obviously, that's the case. Why? Why do good people keep doing nothing? Why? And not even doing nothing. It's even worse than that, Jan. People are helping the predators. They're helping the criminals. They're helping the tyrants. They're voting them in, for crying out loud. They're showing up for repeated instances of obvious abuse. Like, we think of things like Stockholm Syndrome, or women who are beaten brutally by their husbands, coming home on a drunk tear or whatever, or men that sit around and get abused by their wives in many different ways, right? Like, but they keep showing up. And then even if they break it off with that person and finally get out there, they end up finding themselves with another partner that's just like that. Meaning there's a mechanism in them and in all of us that is actually trying to escape reality. We are afraid of reality. Nature is harsh. Nature has consequences. nature doesn't care about feelings. It's very impersonal. So people look at that as the evil. And I have a feeling that a lot of this mechanism, because it's everywhere, a lot of this has to do with trauma, I think. If you get into psychology and you look at some of the great thinkers, they were all trying to wrestle with this exact question I'm laying out here, is why do people keep supporting their own enslavement? Why do people keep returning to their abusers for more abuse, etc.? And the answer is that they're lost at sea because they don't have the right prescription for life given to them at a young age. And they've not been taught how to actually deal with that pain and that trauma. They haven't been taught how to love themselves and how to know what they are. And so what fills that gap? All the soothsayers, all the con men, all the psychos, all the predators are going to fill in that gap if you don't fill that gap for yourself. So with that, let me just read this quote because you're going to love it, man. You're going to love it. It is, let me just grab it. Yeah, here it is. So imagine, Jan, we taught children this. I'm teaching my children this. And I'm not seeing any self-esteem issues with them so far. And this is what we're teaching them. Nikola Tesla. Everyone should consider their body as a priceless gift, a marvelous work of art, of indescribable beauty, and a mystery beyond human conception. And it's so delicate that a word, a breath, a look, nay, even a thought might injure it. So, I mean, you think, oh, Tesla, he was one of those geniuses that gave us the ability to even have this conversation with the technology that he invented. He was a scientist that was also a mystic. So he was like both left and right brain. He lived to a very old age. A lot of people think they may have taken him out because he was onto some interesting research. Either way, the guy only slept like 3 hours a night, and according to his own diaries, and yet he's animated with just pure genius and creativity. And so what is it? Well, does it have anything to do with his basic worldview? That he's not denying nature. He's trying to work with nature and harness the force of nature to benefit humanity. Not looking at the world as an illusion even though he might say some of the way we look at the world is an illusion because the illusion is produced in your head. It's not the thing itself. It's the way you're looking at it that's the illusion, right? And that was where, or he would say, why don't you love your body and your mind and your soul and everything you are, and look at it as a gift and look at it as something that is of indescribable beauty and that it's delicate. By saying that it's delicate, he's indicating that it's something you need to care for. It's something you care and you put love into. Not a bloated false sense of self-image love, which turns into narcissism. I would actually argue that narcissism as a phenomena is the opposite of what the ego is. The narcissist is the one that actually hates themselves, which is why they need to artificially elevate themselves above others. That's a narcissist. So the narcissist is actually lacking a self. They're not full of themselves. They're empty of a self. Mm-hmm. And what is this Eastern mysticism trying to teach everybody? Empty yourself. You're nothing. You're everything and you're nothing. And your body is an illusion, and the world you're seeing is an illusion, and everything you're seeing is an illusion. And so just close your eyes for extended periods of time and breathe in this very weird manner, make these humming sounds, and suddenly then you get to commune with God. And it's always out there. It's out of this world. It's out of your body. It's out of this reality. It's all these dimensions and spiritual dimensions beyond our sight and vision and our ability to prove it. So it's all just mysteria in your head. You have no way to prove it. But why do people latch on? Because it's more comfortable to believe a lie than to face the truth. And that's the real factor. The real factor is people haven't been taught this. Well, they have. They just never knew who to learn it from. Their parents probably didn't teach it. Their culture didn't teach it. Their priest didn't teach it. And also, there's a need inside of us that is we want to escape reality. We want to escape it. And the reason we want to escape it is because I think there's maybe even some genetic memory of past trauma that may have happened on this planet. Cataclysm.
I was just about to say that.
Yeah, just think of the tides of history, man. Like it's just nothing but a blood fest. It's crazy, right? And so that trauma, there's genetic memory of that in everybody. The whole planet was going through these things. And there's other traumas that we can get into. And then that's when you're born pure. You have that sort of in your genetic memory as a potential. Then stack the trauma of your life on top of that. And so you're just lost at sea, deer in the headlights. You're shivering. You're riddled with anxiety and depression and fear because you've got no anchor. Your anchor was taken away from you by this priestcraft. And then when you go to the church to try to find Jesus or try to find the Buddha, light, and nirvana or whatever, enlightenment, all these guys are doing is telling you, sit down, close your eyes, and shut your mouth and listen and do as you're told. And we're going to get you to float out of your body, and then you'll finally be free. Freedom can't be found here. It's all just when it equates to basically, in my mind, I call it a death cult. Because in the end, I think that's what these people secretly crave, is they want freedom from themselves. They want freedom from the pain of life. They're afraid of life, bro. And that's a sad state. And instead of the priest going like the ancient shaman used to do, or the ancient sages and all these, they would come in, the real priests, the real scientists, they would come in and go, oh, you just need an anchor. You just need to be empowered. You need to go on a journey for 3 days and learn about yourself in a natural way. See the difference with what you were looking at, where they were telling you, you need to embrace suffering and meditate and everything. It's a very unnatural way of doing it. That's why it's so difficult for so many people to do. But the way that they used to do it in, say, the First Nations tribes in Canada, or some of the older shamanic cultures, or even the Spartan cultures, right? They would send the young man out or the young woman out for 3 days on their own to go on basically a vision quest or a hunting trip, or in fact, they'd even send them off to war just to be in the back lines, feeding the horses, just to get the vibe of it. Something to challenge them with nature and get them to confront nature and realize the truth of what nature really is, that it's both yin and yang. It's love and hate. It's fury and peace. It's unforgiving and it's beautiful. Like, it's everything. And so you come back from that trip and you survive it. That empowers that being moving forward for the rest of their lives. And now they are one of the tribe. They are strong. They've graduated. See, that's the old way of doing it. Now it's sit down and just shut your brain off. And they often say that, no mind, no logic, no reason. We don't want you deciphering the real chicanery of what's going on here. So shut your logical brain off and go and live in your bliss state. That's escapism 101, and I think people want it secretly.
Everything is geared towards that. It's either the no mind thing, or if you've got anxiety or you feel depressed or something, don't actually think about the reasons why you might be having a tough time. Don't think about that.
Don't get to the root of it.
Just take this pill off and you shut your brain off. You shut the negative thoughts off. But my whole thing is you got to challenge your automatic negative thoughts. That's what I believe in. Because I don't know about you, I'm pretty sure everybody on this planet, as soon as something happens, you don't know you have an expectation until something happens. That's completely new. And then you're like, oh, that was in there. And a lot of people don't know how to deal with that. They shut down, or they go into panic mode, or get really upset when something happens. They get sad, and that's it. They're done. And we get trained to be like that. And then you have things like A Course in Miracles, which brings up the solipsism thing, or nowadays you have moral relativism, where truth is subjective and you can, everybody has their own truth, and that makes it okay for, if you feel like you want to be a frog tomorrow and then you want to be a woman tomorrow, you can just go cut a significant amount of skin off of your forearm and glue a fake dick on, and your life will be great. And that's body mutilation, isn't it? Yeah, it's the same thing. Yeah, and I literally had somebody earlier last year tell me that I'm a judgmental person because I said a man cannot be a woman, and because there was a study that was done that said that frogs could be gay, and I said, okay, and you call yourself a therapist? And you are jumping on me, telling me that I'm a judgmental person. But when you point one finger, you have three pointing back at you.
100%.
In my personal view, if you think that that's okay for people to mutilate themselves and have their free will and all of the things that make them special and unique hijacked and just stripped from them altogether, so that they can do things like that, then you don't really care about people. You care about ideas that make you sound politically correct where the hurt is concerned. You're afraid to have your own view, and you're afraid to critically think about how people are being impacted by the things that they do. You don't have to get personally involved. That's not what I'm saying. Like, you have to let people do what they want to do, because one of the saddest realities of this life is that you can't want more for somebody than what they want for themselves. Everybody has to reach their own conclusions on their own. But at the same time,
that's right.
I think that's what's happening these days, is that this death cult has hijacked our ability to care for each other and to speak up and say that, hey, perhaps you better think this through. You know, as soon as you start saying stuff like that, you're public enemy number one.
Yeah, it's true. And think about that phrase, judgmental. People use that as a negative thing. And I'm like, what, you weren't taught to have good judgment? You know, judgment is a virtue. No, I'm not going to judge you like I'm some kind of judge, jury, execute. That's not what I'm thinking in judgment, but my judgment is extremely valuable. And just because my judgment doesn't match your judgment doesn't mean that somehow there's a moral equivalency to that. It's just, we all have to have the ability to judge things for ourselves. And hey, if that person wants to believe that they can transcend reality and defy the laws of nature and go and do all this stuff to manipulate themselves, and they feel like they're going to find happiness out of that at the end, hey, it's a free canvas. You go right ahead. That's your choice. But when we start grabbing children at a young age and dumping this toxic sludge into their minds, you're stunting their development. And that's my concern. Is I believe in freedom, but I don't believe that you have the right to violate the freedom of children who are impressionable with things that are completely unsubstantiated. And there's a whole debate on that specific issue. But I actually think that issue, that whole thing where it's gone from just accepting people as they are to promoting grooming programs in schools and in the culture to promote this type of essentially body disassociation, body dysphoria. It used to be called body dysphoria. They're trying to promote this as if it's rational, and it's going to end up, bringing some kind of acceptance to that child. When if that's the issue, is just that person struggling being accepted. I mean, they haven't been taught how to be a self, how to define who they are. They're having an identity crisis because it's not an identity with the physical body. It's an inner identity crisis that now is just becoming reflected through this new dogma, right? And I think that this isn't just some natural phenomena that's happening because we let some people out of the asylum or whatever. This is something that I think is an attack. I think this is actually a particular mechanism of cultural narrative warfare, where if you want to infiltrate Western cultures, which is a desire by many of these Eastern cults, you have to bring in the ideas that are going to bring down the pillars of that enemy culture. And the pillar of our culture originally in the West was about heroism, being a strong individual rooted in reality, studying nature, a gardener of nature, not like nature's some evil thing. Totally the idea of freedom and all of that. And if you want to come in and bring in those ideas so you can change the order of say, Western civilization, what better way than to bring in, again, that non-dualistic concept, which is what the foundation of all this transhumanism is, all the other types of trans stuff. I'm not saying anything against transgendered people, talking about a weaponized political tool that is being used to take out the foundations of people that would otherwise not have that view, right? It's a way of indoctrinating people, and you got to start with young children. So I think this is actually if you really zoom out and you put all the pieces together, I think that there's a coordinated attack going on to bring these ideas in simply to muddy the water and raise the new generation to be completely antagonistic towards any kind of rational, grounded, natural philosophy that's rooted in all those beautiful elements that you're bringing up of becoming a strong individual that can then go and be a stronger unit of a community, of a family, of a country, of a world, right? You can't do it backwards. You have to start with that individual first. And so I think this is an attack on the psyche. This is part of this agenda to eradicate freedom, essentially. And you have to do that by eradicating the idea of freedom. And in order to eradicate the idea of freedom, you have to eradicate the idea of reality. And if you can do that, then you can implant anything you want into people's minds. And I think that's what we're witnessing. And that's why I try to gear my work towards, I'm not trying to hate anybody at all. I just have a problem with lies and toxic ideas that actually disempower people. Even though it seems like it's a good thing, it's not in the end. And if we promote the truth and we promote reality and say, hey, nature is our greatest teacher. Let's look at it for a change, and let's learn from it. Let's learn from our mistakes in the past. And we try to empower these kids with the truth and show them stuff from people like Tesla, like I just read. And there's so much more we could cover on that. Well, then that's going to be what helps this problem, not telling them, hey, we can surgically turn you into a giraffe if you feel like it that day. It's just, I don't understand how people are even seriously having this conversation, but it proves that mind control does exist after all, doesn't it?
It really does. I agree with everything you've said. David, where can we find you?
My website is dwtruthwarrior.com. It'll lead you to all the other stuff I do. I do a lot of stuff. So I've been working on a documentary series called Cult of the Medics. It's an investigation into the occult history of the medical industrial complex, and much more. It's a free series. The first 9 chapters are done, and they're available at cultofthemedics.com. So people can go and check that out if they're interested in that subject. And then if they want to come and explore a deep dive of these subjects that we've talked about today, I do have this Truth Warrior Premium program. You can get it on my site. And that's where you can find this presentation that I did on the dark side of Tibetan Buddhism. And stay tuned for the episode I'll be hopefully booking in the next month or two with Christine Chandler to interview her as a survivor and get her take on all this. So got a lot coming up, but yeah, that's where you can find my work, man.
Fantastic. David, thanks for being on the Boundless Authenticity podcast.
Well, thanks for having me, man. It's always a joy, and congrats on the work you're doing, and please keep doing it.
I appreciate that. The most important skill you need is how to process and let go of negative thoughts and emotions that create negative outcomes in your life. How often are you going about your day and you experience something that was said or done by someone, or you see it on social media or the TV or in public, and it changes your mood for the worse? Maybe you suddenly experience crippling anxiety, rage, or immediately feel drained and depressed. This happens to so many these days, and in fact, can happen to anyone, because we are all human. And let's face it, this world will break you down without the right tools to handle it. Most of us don't want to feel disempowered by normal life experiences. Most of us really don't have the energy to expend on these lower frequency states of being. I'm Jahan Sator, CTAA certified in cognitive behavioral therapy, hypnotherapy, nutrition, and specialist in the area of subconscious self-sabotage. A decade ago, I was a complete prisoner to my own negative automatic thoughts and emotions. I decided to be done with it. I learned how to manage self-sabotaging behaviors, handle negative automatic thoughts and beliefs, and I am here to show you easy and effective ways to beat patterns of overthinking, overanalyzing, replaying self-defeating thoughts, recreating mediocre circumstances, and a feeling of stuckness in everyday life. Let me teach you what I have learned in 10 years of study, teaching, coaching, and self-realizing, the proven methods for overcoming tough emotions in my workshop on Friday, February 17th, 2023 at 6 p.m. EST. Admission $55 USD and registration is easy. Send an email to jahantwsator@gmail.com. That's JEHANTWSATTAUR@gmail.com. PayPal only. Limited availability to 10 guests. Meeting hosted on Zencaster. Must have a computer with Google Chrome or Brave browser.